There is a system in your brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is that your life no longer matches the environment it was designed for. You call it laziness. Your brain calls it resource conservation. And the uncomfortable truth is that your brain is probably right more often than you think. Because laziness is not a character flaw. It is a feature of biological machinery optimized for a world that no longer exists. And once you understand what's actually happening, you stop fighting yourself and start working with the system you inherited. Here's what nobody tells you about effort. Your brain runs on about 20 watts of power, roughly the same as a dim light bulb. But it consumes 20% of your body's total energy budget, while representing only 2% of your mass. This is not metaphor. This is metabolic reality. Every decision you make, every task you resist, every moment of focus or distraction is your brain calculating whether the energy expenditure is worth the predicted reward. And here's the uncomfortable part. Your brain is not designed to help you achieve your goals. It is designed to keep you alive long enough to reproduce. Those two things overlap sometimes, but not as often as you'd like. When you feel lazy, what you are actually experiencing is a mismatch between what your environment is asking of you and what your reward prediction system believes is worth the caloric investment. This is not a character flaw. This is hardware doing exactly what 2 million years of natural selection wired it to do. Your ancestors who conserved energy when food was uncertain survived. The ones who burned calories chasing every interesting idea did not. You are the descendant of the careful ones, the ones who defaulted to rest unless there was a very good reason not to. The problem is that your brain still thinks a good reason means immediate survival, reproduction, or social status. Checking email does not qualify. Here's where it gets interesting. Your brain runs a cost-benefit analysis every single time you consider doing something, and this happens so fast you don't even notice it. The prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, weighs effort against reward. But here's the thing. This system evolved in environments where energy was scarce and every calorie mattered. If a savanna hominid spent energy climbing a tree for fruit that might not be there, that was a survival risk. Your ancestors who conserved energy when the payoff was uncertain lived longer and had more offspring. You are their direct descendant. Your brain is still running that software. The problem is that in a world where most of your goals involve sitting still and focusing, this energy conservation system misfires constantly. Your brain treats starting that work project the same way it treats climbing a tree for potentially non-existent fruit. High effort, uncertain reward, system says no. Here's the uncomfortable part. What you call laziness is your brain doing exactly what 2 million years of evolution trained it to do. Conserve energy unless the reward is immediate, visible, and certain. In the ancestral environment, wasting calories on uncertain outcomes could mean starvation. Your ancestors who hesitated before expending energy without guaranteed payoff survived longer. The ones who burned energy freely on speculative tasks didn't make it long enough to become your ancestors. So when you feel that visceral resistance to starting a difficult task, that's not a character flaw. That's your biological machinery treating cognitive effort the same way it treats running up a hill. Your brain is doing exactly what 200,000 years of evolution designed it to do, which is conserve energy in the face of uncertain rewards. Here's where it gets interesting. The CEO of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, is supposed to override these ancient systems. It's the part that plans, resists impulses, manages time. But here's what nobody tells you about the CEO. It runs on an extremely limited battery. Every decision you make, every email you resist checking, every temptation you ignore drains the same metabolic resource pool. By the time you sit down to do something difficult but important, your prefrontal cortex is already running on fumes. Meanwhile, the dopamine system in your midbrain, the reward prediction system, is fully charged and screaming for immediate gratification. That's not a character flaw. That's an engineering problem. Here's where people usually get it wrong. They think laziness is a personality trait, something you either have or don't have, something you overcome with discipline or motivation. But your brain doesn't process effort that way. Your biological machinery evaluates every action through a cost-benefit lens shaped by evolution. If your brain calculates that the effort required exceeds the perceived reward, it doesn't send you the motivation signal. It's not that you're weak. It's that your reward prediction system is doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is conserve energy in an environment where calories used to be scarce and threats were immediate. Here's where people usually get it wrong. They think laziness is a character flaw, something to overcome with discipline or motivation. But your brain doesn't operate on moral principles. It operates on metabolic efficiency. For most of human history, expending energy without a clear and immediate payoff was literally dangerous. If you burned calories chasing something uncertain, you might not have enough reserves to escape a predator or survive a famine. So your brain evolved to be an accountant, constantly calculating energy expenditure against predicted reward. And here's the uncomfortable part. That system is still running. But now it's making decisions in a world that no longer matches the environment it was built for. The CEO of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, can override short-term impulses when conditions are right. But the CEO doesn't run the whole operation. Deeper systems, older systems, the ones that kept your ancestors alive long enough to reproduce, those are still calling a lot of the shots. And one of their primary directives is simple: conserve energy whenever possible, because for most of human history, calories were scarce and unpredictable. Your brain evolved in an environment where doing nothing meant survival. Sitting still conserved energy. Moving only when necessary kept you alive longer. Fast forward to now, and that same hardware is running inside a world where food is everywhere, threats are abstract, and most of your problems can't be solved by moving your body. Your brain still thinks saving energy is the smart move. This is where people usually get it wrong. They think laziness is a character flaw, a lack of discipline, a failure of willpower. But your brain isn't lazy, it's efficient. And efficiency, in biological terms, meant not dying when calories were scarce and predators were real. Here's what actually happens. Your brain runs a constant cost-benefit analysis on every action you consider. Will this effort yield a reward worth the energy expenditure? That calculation happens mostly below conscious awareness, in circuits shaped by millions of years of evolution where food was hard to get and predators were everywhere. In that world, conserving energy was survival. Sitting still when there was no threat and no food nearby kept you alive longer. Moving without a clear payoff was wasteful, even dangerous. Your ancestors who burned energy inefficiently didn't pass on their genes. You are descended from the lazy ones, the ones who rested when they could. That same machinery is still running in your head, but now the predators are deadlines and the food is always available, and your brain has no firmware update to handle that mismatch. Here's the uncomfortable part. When you call yourself lazy, you are describing a feature, not a bug. Your brain is calculating effort versus reward in real time, and if the reward feels distant, abstract, or uncertain, your biological machinery will default to energy conservation. This is not a character flaw. This is your brain doing exactly what kept your ancestors alive when food was scarce and every calorie mattered. The problem is that your life now runs on deadlines and long-term goals. And your brain still treats a vague future reward the same way it treats no reward at all. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. It is a reward prediction system, and it fires hardest not when you get the reward, but when you expect it. If you cannot predict when or if the reward will come, dopamine does not spike. And without that spike, your prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, does not get the fuel it needs to override the impulse to do nothing. This is why you can scroll for an hour without effort, but cannot start a project that will benefit you in 6 months. Scrolling delivers predictable micro-rewards every few seconds. The project delivers an abstract maybe reward in a future your dopamine system does not care about. Now, this sounds depressing, but it actually isn't. If your laziness were a moral failure, you would be stuck with it. But if it is a hardware mismatch, you can engineer around it. You cannot change what your brain prioritizes, but you can change what it perceives as immediate and certain. This is not about willpower. This is about friction, prediction, and environmental design. Let me pause for a second and ask you something people rarely ask honestly. What is the hardest part of living with this? Not the version you explain to others, but the part you deal with alone. If you feel comfortable, leave a comment. Not for advice, just to name it. You'd be surprised how many people are carrying the same thing quietly. What actually works is not increasing motivation. Motivation is an outcome, not a tool. What works is shrinking the gap between effort and reward until your dopamine system recognizes the action as worthwhile. The smaller the task, the faster the perceived reward, the more likely your brain will classify it as doable. You do not need to want to do it. You need to reduce the biological cost of starting it. Start with what researchers call implementation intentions, which is a terrible name for a simple idea. Your brain does not respond well to, "I should work on this." It responds to, "At this time, in this place, I will do this specific thing." Vague goals trigger vagueness in your reward prediction system. Specific cues trigger specific preparation. If you say, "I will write at my desk at 9 a.m., your brain begins preparing the night before, priming the neural circuits, reducing the activation energy needed to start. This is not discipline. This is pre-commitment that leverages how your brain codes future behavior. Here is where people usually get it wrong. They take a massive goal, break it into smaller goals, and still fail because the smaller goals are still too abstract. If your goal is write the introduction, your brain still sees an undefined task with no clear endpoint. If your goal is write one paragraph about why this topic matters, your brain sees a completable unit with a predictable reward. The difference is not motivational. The difference is computational. Your brain can model finishing a paragraph. It cannot model finishing an introduction. The second protocol is environmental friction asymmetry. Make the thing you want to do easier to start than the thing you are avoiding it with. If you are avoiding work by scrolling, put your phone in another room. If you cannot do that, delete the apps and reinstall them every time you want to use them. This sounds extreme, but it works not because it stops you, but because it introduces a delay, and in that delay, your prefrontal cortex has time to reassess. Every second of friction is a second your CEO brain can step in and override the autopilot. And here is the part nobody talks about. This fails if you are running on a depleted system, if you are chronically sleep-deprived, if you are skipping meals, if you are living in a constant state of low-level stress. Your prefrontal cortex is already compromised, and no amount of environmental design will compensate. You cannot engineer focus if your brain is in energy conservation mode. Sleep is not optional. Consistent blood sugar is not optional. These are not wellness tips. These are hardware requirements. One more thing. Laziness increases when the stakes feel too high. If starting means risking failure, your brain will interpret starting as a threat, and threats activate avoidance. This is why people procrastinate most on things that matter most. The solution is not to care less. The solution is to decouple starting from succeeding. You are not sitting down to write a great essay. You are sitting down to write anything for 10 minutes. That distinction matters biologically. Threat activation drops. Dopamine prediction rises, and the system shifts from avoidance to approach. If this made sense to you, it is not because you are broken. It is because your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do in the wrong environment. Understanding that does not fix everything, but it gives you leverage. And leverage is where real change starts. If this way of thinking helps you see yourself more clearly,